Good evening. My name is Paul Goren. I am the chairperson of the Department of Political Science at the University of Minnesota. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our Views from the U event, the election of 2020. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. Tonight, our panel of experts will take us beyond the headlines to learn about the 2020 election. Tonight's topics will include the electoral context, national and state elections, the election's impact on the Supreme Court, the movement for racial justice, and the backlash in the Twin Cities and nationally, identity politics, partisan polarization, and many other topics. Here to tell us all about it are Professors Timothy Johnson, Andrew Karch, Howard Lavine, August Nimtz, and Kathryn Pearson. Here's how we'll proceed. I'll introduce each of our panelists and then turn things over to them for their individual presentations. Each panelist will take approximately 10 minutes to summarize what research says about their respective topics. After the panelists are done, we'll take questions from our audience. As a reminder for our viewers, you can submit questions through the Q&A function throughout tonight's event. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. In this spirit, I will sometimes take the liberty of combining multiple questions that raise similar points. Our first panelist is Professor Kathryn Pearson. Dr. Pearson is Morse Alumni Distinguished Professor of Political Science and the Associate Chair of the department. She is a leading national expert on the US Congress, congressional elections, and women in politics. She has published a book and multiple research articles. Prior to joining the University of Minnesota, Dr. Pearson worked for 5 years on Capitol Hill as a legislative assistant for 2 members of Congress and as a research fellow at the Brookings Institution. As many of you know, she is a frequent contributor to local media outlets, including TPT Almanac, NPR, Fox 9, and KARE 11. Go ahead, Kathryn.
Great. Thank you, Paul, and thanks to my Department of Political Science colleagues and the staff, and especially thanks to our audience for being with us today. So I'm going to start by focusing on the Electoral College and then turn to US Senate races and House races and the consequences for electoral politics and representation. So US presidential elections are really comprised of 50 statewide contests, and very few of them are competitive. We think of the contest for the presidency as a national election, but in practice, it consists of simultaneous state elections, and that is state elections with different rules about voting in elections, I might add. The Electoral College shapes presidential candidates' campaign strategies and election outcomes, along with citizens' opportunities to engage in the process. The founders proposed the Electoral College in an effort to mix state, congressional, and popular participation in the presidential selection process. Is stipulated in Article 2 of the Constitution, the number of electoral votes in each state equals its total number of representatives in Congress, that is, its members of the House, plus its 2 senators. Remember, the Constitution favors small states, as they were given the same number of senators as large states. Everyone got 2. This, of course, helps small states in the Senate, and it translates into an advantage in the Electoral College as well. The Constitution left it to states to choose electors who would then deliberate and choose a trusted candidate. But this deliberative body of electors didn't work out as intended. By 1824, 18 of the 24 states permitted popular voting for presidential electors, and other states soon followed suit. So today, we are left with the constitutional framework that has important consequences in our presidential elections. Of course, to win, a candidate needs 270 out of 538 electoral votes. If it's a 269 to a 269 tie, and there are different ways to achieve this, the decision would then go to the House of Representatives, with each state, not each member, having 1 vote. 48 states cast all of their electoral votes for the candidate who receives the most popular votes in that state, no matter what the margin. 2 states, Maine and Nebraska, allocate some votes based on congressional district level outcomes. In this winner take all or loser take nothing system, a candidate can come very close in a state or several states, but get no electoral college votes. Of course, the most striking implication of the Electoral College is that the winner of the popular vote is not the guaranteed winner of the Electoral College. This happened, of course, in 2016, 2000, 1888, and 1876. Recent US election results, then, do not reflect majority rule. Republicans have won the popular vote for president only once in the last 20 years, and yet have controlled the presidency for 12 of those 20 years. The Electoral College drives candidate strategy and voter experiences. Candidates have strong incentives to spend more time and more money in swing states that are rich with Electoral College votes. And political science research shows that some voters are better informed in those states as they get more attention from the candidates. Next slide, please. I like this slide from the Cook Political Report stringing together 270 Electoral College votes. The size of the dots represent the number of Electoral College votes, and the color coding indicates whether or not they are leaning toward Biden, or they're solid for Biden and blue, or if they're solid red or sort of lighter red leaning for Trump, or if they're a toss-up, gray. So what this Electoral College chart shows us is that there are several competitive states, and that in order to get to 270, President Trump would need to win over one of the states that's currently leaning toward Biden. But as we know from 2016, the margins can be close in some of these races. Next slide, please. I want to turn now to talk about different statewide contests, and that, of course, is the US Senate. Currently, Republicans hold 53 US Senate seats. Democrats need to pick up 4 to win majority party control. There are 35 seats up in 2020, including 2 special elections, and 23 are held by Republicans. And so despite the fact that many of these seats are in solidly Republican areas, Republicans are on defense, structurally disadvantaged by the large number of seats they're defending. Democrats will likely lose Doug Jones' seat in Alabama. Gary Peters' seat in Michigan, held by Democrats, is also competitive. So really, Democrats would need to pick up 5 or maybe even 6. But Republicans are playing defense in 7 competitive races. Montana and Iowa, both held by Republican incumbents, are deemed by CQ Roll Call, the author of this chart, as toss-ups. And in North Carolina, Maine, Colorado, and Arizona, incumbent Republicans may very well lose. Trump is bringing down support for some of these senators who have supported him in key swing states. Georgia has 2 competitive races, but because Georgia's voting rules are different, it's likely that these will go to runoffs, although we don't know. In order to win outright, candidates in Georgia need 50% plus 1. It's also worth remembering that Senate malapportionment means that a minority of voters elect a majority of senators. Next slide, please. What began as a small advantage for small states in the Constitution evolved over time into significant overrepresentation of sparsely populated rural states. For most of our history, this rural bias did not tilt the partisan playing field because both major parties appealed to both urban and rural voters. This is no longer true if you look at an Electoral College map. Democrats won more votes overall for the US Senate in 2016 and 2018, yet Republicans hold 53 of the 100 seats today. The 47 Democrats represent many more people, as this slide indicates, than the 53 Republicans. And if you look closely at this slide, since the 1980s, when Republicans have controlled the US Senate, they've rarely represented a majority of Americans, as Republicans are more likely to represent sparsely populated states. Finally, Senate malapportionment means that individuals' political power varies depending on the size of the state that they live in. As of 2018, California voters had 19.8 million residents for each of its 2 senators, while Wyoming had 283,500 residents for each of its 2 senators. Slide, please. And now, finally, I'll turn to the US House. So one takeaway from this slide, which also has the competitiveness map from CQ and Roll Call, is that the vast majority of US House races are not competitive. You can see that only 20 are shaded in yellow, meaning only 20 are about too close to call. The 91% incumbency reelection rate that we saw in 2018 is actually pretty low by contemporary standards. It's been 98 in other recent cycles. So incumbents are advantaged, as we know, and we teach in all of our courses, but increasingly there is a partisan advantage for most congressional districts. Most representatives live and represent districts that swing pretty heavily toward one party or the other. The real exceptions are the districts which are very competitive in this particular cycle. In Minnesota, the most competitive districts in this cycle are Minnesota's 1st district and Minnesota's 7th district. And the 7th district actually is a district that definitely favors Trump. It went for Trump by 30 points in 2016, yet Democratic incumbent Colin Peterson, elected in 1990, has long been popular as chairman of the Agriculture Committee. So we'll see in Minnesota's 7th district, is it a partisan advantage or is it an incumbency advantage? Nationwide, Democrats are in a great position to expand their majority in the House. In the 2008 midterms, they gained 41 seats, even more than expected, and in doing so, they expanded in some less friendly territory, winning new suburban districts. With such gains, we wouldn't think they'd be in a position to expand their majority, but they are, in part because vulnerable Republicans who have supported Trump are now facing quality Democratic challengers. In the House, of course, districts have the same number of people in them within each state and roughly across states, as long as all states have at least one representative. But it's worth remembering that Democratic districts tend to be less efficient for the Democratic Party. So it is possible, as happened in 2012, that Democratic House candidates can get more votes while Republicans still maintain majority party control of the House. But that is not likely in 2020. Democrats are poised to pick up seats. Slide, please. Women candidates and women voters were a big story in 2018. A record number of women ran for Congress, a record number won, and the gender gap with women across subgroups preferring the Democratic candidates was as large as ever. Yet women are setting records in 2020 as well, with 298 women running for the House this November. This figure from the Center for American Women in Politics shows the increase since 1990 of Republican and Democratic women candidates for the primary or general election. Republicans are in red, Democrats are blue. And you'll note how close and how low they were back in 1990. But in the general election this year, there are 204 Democrats running and 94 Republicans running, women. And that's a huge gap between them, bigger than the gender gap in the electorate. But research shows that Democrats are more likely to recruit and encourage and to fund women candidates than the Republican Party is. Slide, please. I want to turn now briefly to a figure showing the women who currently serve in the US House. A record number of women serve in the House, 101 in the House and then 26 over in the Senate, and a record 47 women of color serve in the two chambers. Yet still, women comprise only 24% of the House. And the gap between parties is even more stark than it was in the slide with candidates, as Democratic women were more likely to win in 2018. In 2020, both parties are poised to elect new women to the House, but the gains will still be incremental. Some of the most competitive US Senate races feature two women, a Democratic woman running against a Republican incumbent, and many of the House races also feature two women. I want to turn finally to partisan differences in the House of Representatives. In the next slide. So this is my last slide, and it just shows the current composition along race and gender lines of the current US House of Representatives. In the Republican Conference, which includes all Republicans, there are 13 women and 187 men and only 9 people of color. In the Democratic Caucus, which includes all Democrats, white men are a plurality at 91, but there are 96 people of color among Democrats, including 55 men and 41 women, and then there are 48 white women. The racial and ethnic diversity in the Democratic Caucus reflects, to some extent, the diversity in the Democratic electorate. According to David Wasserman, House Democrats today represent 79% of all Asians, 72% of Latinx, 66% of African Americans, 60% of college graduates, 45% of whites, 39% of Trump voters, and 20% of America's land area. The next Congress is poised to be more diverse, with most of the diversity again coming from the Democratic side. If Democrats have unified party control of the White House, Senate, and House of Representatives, and that's a huge if, they will have a full agenda. To enact their agenda, though, they will need to reach compromises both within their own party, and in this polarized era, it will be a big challenge to work with Republicans across the aisle. The end.
Thank you, Kathryn. Our second panelist is Professor Andrew Karch. Dr. Karch is the Arlene C. Carlson Professor in the Department of Political Science and the Director of Graduate Studies. His expertise centers on public policy in the contemporary United States with a special focus on federalism, state and local politics. He has published multiple books and research articles on federalism, education policy, and American political development. Go ahead, Andy.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. And like Kathryn, I want to begin by thanking the staff who made this event possible, as well as our audience who's joined us this evening. So while most of our attention and most of the media's attention and pundits' attention is focused on the national level, I want to offer a reminder that the stakes at the state level are in some ways just as high as they are at the national level. And so I'll begin by talking a little bit about where things stand and then a little bit about what's exactly at stake next Tuesday. So on the left, you can see where things stand. And it's basically, it's a chart from The Economist putting together data from the National Conference of State Legislatures showing that right now, at this moment in time, going into the election, we have a fairly equal division between Republican state lawmakers and Democratic state lawmakers. About 52% of the over 7,200 state legislators in the United States are Republicans, about 47% are Democrats. Now, of course, we're not simply interested in the overall average across the entire country. We're also interested in control of legislative chambers, control of governorships, and the overall existence of what have come to be called trifectas, unified party control of the state. And here again, Republicans have an advantage. They currently control 29 state legislatures, 26 governorships, and they exercise unified control of 21 states. Democrats, on the other hand, control 19 state legislatures, 24 governorships, and they have unified control of 15 states. There's only one state in the country with a divided legislature. That, of course, is Minnesota. There are 13 other states that are divided between a one party controlling the governorship and another party controlling the state legislature. Now, the figure on the left suggests that at the state level, there can be massive changes, right? Shifts can occur on a dime. That's basically what happened in 2010. And there's at least the possibility of major change because over 80% of state legislative seats are up for election this year. Similar to what Kathryn said about the national level, at the state level as well, I think most of those who are handicapping these elections would say that Republicans are primarily playing defense and Democrats have some opportunities for gains. That being said, in the average election year, about 12 state legislative chambers change hands, and I think very few analysts expect the number to be that high this year. Another thing to keep in mind are the 11 gubernatorial races that are being held this year. And here, there isn't a whole lot interesting going on. I think the state that's most likely to change party control is Montana. And there are incumbents in 9 of the 11 elections, and many of them are favored to stay in office. Finally, next week, in about half the states, residents will have the opportunity not only to vote on their representatives, but also to vote on specific issues. They have the ability to accept or reject proposals that either citizens have initiated or that state lawmakers are putting on the ballot before them. Now this year, there's actually a smaller number of ballot initiatives than in the typical year, primarily because of COVID-19 and various public safety measures that made in-person signature gathering basically impossible. But nonetheless, there are initiatives on the legalization of medicinal and recreational marijuana, criminal justice reform, taxes, abortion, various other issues that are really central to American politics. And so it's just a reminder that a lot of the important decisions that affect Americans in their daily lives are actually made not in the halls of Congress, but actually at the state level. In my remaining time, I want to talk very briefly about 3 different ways that what happens, or what will happen at the state level, will resonate nationally. It will have national level implications. So I want to talk about redistricting, election administration, and what I'm broadly calling resistance. Next slide, please. So let's start with redistricting. So one reason why state elections are so important in this particular cycle has to do with the fact that we're about to begin the next cycle of reapportionment and redistricting. Reapportionment is the reallocation of seats in the US House of Representatives every 10 years based on the census that is taken every 10 years. Redistricting is the process of then dividing states into congressional districts. And what's important to note is that that process, that map drawing process, takes place at the state level. It's also true that state lawmakers draw their own districts. And so what you see here are 2 sort of maps, right? The one on the left is a cartoon that traces the ways that this process can be manipulated for partisan gain, which I'll say more about in a moment. And the map on the right is the current set of congressional districts in Minnesota. Minnesota's redistricting process may be particularly interesting and contentious if the state actually loses one of its congressional representatives in this year's reapportionment. Next slide, please. Now, in a politically polarized age, it probably comes as no surprise to say that House districts, and here I'm talking about congressional districts, can and often are drawn to benefit one particular political party. That's equally true of state legislative districts, state Senate districts, state House districts as well. And the way that this process works most often at the state level is that the state legislature draws the districts and the governor has veto power. And so, of course, this means that the individuals who are chosen in this year's state elections will be intimately involved in drawing these districts. Another point that's worth noting about redistricting is that the technology or the data science behind this process has improved immeasurably in recent cycles, making this exercise much more precise. In other words, parties can know with a startling degree of precision how best to draw districts to either put themselves at an advantage or to put their opponents at a disadvantage. And so here is a graphic that was featured in the New York Times that basically describes or depicts some of the most interesting or most striking examples of partisan gerrymandering from the 2010 election cycle. So what this illustrates is both parties do it, right? Democrats controlled Maryland, Democrats controlled Illinois, and you see some examples there. Republicans were particularly advantaged in the 2010 cycle because they had such a great year, right? They were swept into power in many states after the 2010 midterms, enabling them to draw these districts to their advantage. And my personal favorite is Pennsylvania 7, which again is the parent of a 4-year-old. I like to say it's Minnie Mouse kicking Minnie Mouse out of the house, kicking Mickey Mouse out of the house. Another illustration of the importance of partisan gerrymandering comes from a state like North Carolina, which is extraordinarily competitive at the state level. But because Republicans had unified control over the redistricting process, they've been able to draw districts that have consistently given the party as much of a 10-3 advantage in congressional seats. Republicans in Wisconsin have successfully done the same thing at the state level, where Democrats have won a majority of state legislative votes, but nevertheless face a near supermajority of Republican state legislative control. Next slide, please. Okay, the second thing I want to talk about is election administration. And so here I want to do what is almost obligatory for a political scientist giving a presentation. You have to cite either the Federalist Papers or the Constitution. And so I'm going to cite Article 1, Section 4 of the US Constitution, which effectively gives states the responsibility for administering national elections. So as you can see, if you actually read the text, there are some boundaries that are set by the national government, which does have the authority to preempt state laws and enact its own regulations. The truth is that elections are conducted under a mix of national and state laws. And as we've learned this cycle, and Professor Johnson will talk about, the Supreme Court is increasingly inclined to weigh in on how those conditions operate. But the implication that I want to draw out here is that the decisions that voters make this November about state elections will also shape the electorate in future elections. And if I were to ask you, if we were actually in a room together and I were to ask you what it means to be a member of a political community, or about the rights that accompany membership in that political community, chances are many of you would talk about the ability to exercise voice and to participate in politics through the voting process. And again, it's important to recall that voting rights, which are now front and center in discussions of American politics, are set by and large at the state level. Next slide, please. One illustration of how laws shape the electorate is the emergence of voter ID laws, voter identification laws. You can see here on the screen the wide range of state policies that exist with respect to these requirements. In other words, what does an individual have to bring to the polls to participate in an election? There are many states, including Minnesota, that are in gray in the map, where no ID is required to vote. And you could compare that to neighboring Wisconsin, which has a very strict voter ID law. Now, voter ID laws have gotten a lot of attention, but it's really just one of many dimensions along which states vary in ways that affect the exercise, or the ability to exercise, the right to vote. Automatic voter registration, online voter registration, voter rights for those who've been convicted of felony, absentee voting procedures, mail voting procedures, the particular changes that have taken effect in this 2020 cycle, all of those provisions are set at the state level. And that's because there is no right to vote embedded in the US Constitution, which gives the states this type of discretion to determine what it means to be a member of the political community. Next slide, please. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the resistance, but I'm going to use it in a slightly different way than it's often used in the context of American politics. I want to think about it in terms of the relationship between the national government and the states. And what we've seen in an era of partisan polarization is that state governments seem to be increasingly inclined to resist or to push back against national policies that they view as being against their interests. There's often a partisan twinge to this type of pushback. And so the final 6 years of the Obama administration, and really the entirety of the Trump administration, have been characterized by this push and pull between the national level and the states. I think most scholars of federalism would say that there are basically 4 things going on here. One is that because of gridlock at the national level, Congress is not undertaking a great deal of lawmaking. As a result, a lot of relevant or policy relevant decisions are being made in the executive branch or at the state level. And then these controversies, right, because there is often a discrepancy between what the state is pushing for and what the national policy is, these discrepancies are often resolved in the courts. And so one illustration of the importance of the state level here would be a Supreme Court case that is going to be heard very shortly after the election on the Affordable Care Act, which is better known, of course, as Obamacare. And you can see here that state attorneys general from across the country have either signed on to sue for the immediate end to the ACA or to defend the ACA. And so you can see some of the individuals here: Javier Becerra, Maura Healey, Daniel Cameron, Ken Paxton. They represent California, Massachusetts, Kentucky, Texas. These actors used to operate pretty much in the shadows, but as litigation has become a more important part of federalism, they've been taking on an outsized role. Now, the fact that this lawsuit is about the ACA is somewhat unusual. It's much more common these days for states to resist actions taken by the national executive branch, whether we're thinking about the Clean Power Plan under President Obama or various actions that recent administrations have taken with respect to immigration and higher education. So with that, I want to emphasize that there are many understandable reasons why we will be drawn to national results on November 3rd or in the days after November 3rd as we figure out what the election means. But I do want to remind you not to neglect the state level where there are a lot of really interesting dynamics going on that will resonate throughout our politics for the next decade. So thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Our third panelist is Professor August Nimtz. Dr. Nimtz is Professor of Comparative Politics in the Department of Political Science. His work centers on race, class, social movements, and revolutions in countries as diverse as Cuba and South Africa. He's the author of 7 books and dozens of articles. His expertise in the politics of other countries provides him with a unique vantage point on social justice movements in the United States. As a reminder to our viewers, you can submit questions through the Q&A function during Professor Nimtz's talk and throughout the remainder of the event. Go ahead, August.
Thanks, Paul. First, thanks for inviting me to be a part of this, and to all of the staff people who've made this possible, and of course the audience. On Monday evening, May 25th, Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, Caucasian, buried his knee into the neck of George Floyd, a 49-year-old African-American male. After 9 seconds, Floyd was dead. No one could have imagined that next day Minneapolis would be ground zero for the largest social protests in US history, and perhaps worldwide. According to a Sunday New York Times article, quote, an estimated 15 million to 26 million Americans took to the streets, and protests extended into small town and rural America, unquote. The protests in Nigeria, as we speak, reveal that the George Floyd phenomenon continues to reverberate globally. No one also could have imagined that what began here in Minneapolis could factor or would factor significantly into the presidential election next week, what I'd like to focus my brief remarks on. I had the privilege and good luck to be able to attend the first protest, as well as to report on it. Having come of age politically in the 1950s and the 1960s, I was able to bring both political and historical perspective to the action. At least 5,000 of us participated. I think we were all surprised and gratified by the numbers. Mayor Jacob Fry of Minneapolis had intimated earlier in the day that while we had the right to assemble, we could only exercise that right if we had masks on and socially distanced. There were a lot of masks, but not a lot of social distancing, given the reality of that many people trying to assemble in the space where Floyd was killed. In the mayor's police were conspicuously absent. The mayor knew better than to try to discipline a crowd that size, especially with a police force, one of whose members was Derek Chauvin. It was the first progressive mass action anywhere in the US during the pandemic lockdown. Because it took place during the pandemic lockdown, the crowd was overwhelmingly youthful. In fact, I didn't see anyone else with the color of my hair. Neither did most of the protesters have my skin color. For anyone who has been involved in anti-police brutality protests in Minneapolis and St. Paul, at least since 2014, that was not surprising. And no doubt why local reporters made no mention of the fact. But for someone of my generation, an African American, the racial composition of the crowd spoke volumes about what's so different about race in the United States today when compared to the 1960s. Anti-police brutality protests in that era were exclusively African American affairs. In fact, it was dangerous for whites to even be around when the protest took place. As late as 1992, a white truck driver, was almost beaten to death by protesters in Los Angeles in the wake of the Rodney King beating. As for deep history, think 1920, when 3 Black men were lynched in Duluth, Minnesota for allegedly raping a white woman. 10,000 people came out to celebrate their murder. A century later, May 30th, 2020, more than 1,000 people in Duluth of mainly the same skin color came out to denounce what happened to George Floyd. Clearly something had happened between 1920 and 2020 to explain that kind of attitudinal change. That something was the Freedom Now movement, known today as the Civil Rights Movement. Those mass disciplined, nonviolent marches were decisive in the attitudinal changes that took place between 1920 and 2020, and not only for race. That's what makes the George Floyd protest so significant. Again, as the New York Times reported on this past Sunday, quote, 3/4 of Americans supported the protest in June, and large majorities, including 60% of whites, supported the Black Lives Matter movement. Those numbers declined over the course of the summer. As of September, however, 55% of Americans and 45% of white Americans continued to support Black Lives Matter, levels that were considerably higher than ever before in the movement's history, unquote. The most important voting, I argue, is with our feet. I am living testimony to that political truth. The first time I tried to vote was in 1964 in Jim Crow, New Orleans, trying to vote for the lesser evil candidate, Democrat Lyndon Johnson. But I was denied the right to vote owing to my skin color. 4 years later, it was possible for me to vote. Why? Precisely because of what happened between 1964 and 1968. We and our allies had been in the streets. An article in the leading US political science journal, the American Political Science Review, got lots of attention. The article was about Black protests of the 1960s and their impact. The article published this summer concluded that those protests that were violent resulted in white backlash in the election of Richard Nixon over his Democratic opponent, Hubert Humphrey, in the 1968 presidential election. The article got lots of attention because it suggested that the violence that followed some of the George Floyd protests would benefit Trump's reelection. And anyone who regularly watches Tucker Carlson on Fox, as I do, knew indeed that Trump's cheerleaders were hoping exactly for that. I can't tell you how many times the burning liquor store on Lake Street in Minneapolis, on Lake Street in Minnehaha, found its way nightly into Tucker Carlson's coverage, intending to stoke the law and order response to the protests. And never did Tucker Carlson show Officer Chauvin burying his knee in George Floyd's neck. And indeed, Trump got the message and sought to make law and order the road to his reelection, not unlike Richard Nixon did for his election in 1968. We'll know for sure in a week, but I'm not convinced that the law and order white backlash appeal will work today as it was able to do in 1968 for Nixon's election, for 4 reasons. First, the pandemic, I think, is the overarching theme of this election, contrary to what Trump would like. Second, the violence that followed only a few of the George Floyd protests pales in comparison to what took place between 1964 and 1968, and probably did contribute to the defeat of Democratic Party candidate Humphrey and the victory of Nixon. The protests this time were overwhelmingly peaceful and in general framed by the media that way, despite what the crowd at Fox sought to do. Polling data in Minnesota suggests that the law and order appeal gets a hearing outstate, but not in the surrounding suburbs. Keep in mind that the greatest amount of looting and vandalism took place here in the Twin Cities. Kenosha, Wisconsin, perhaps next in scale. For the 1968 election, anecdotal evidence suggests that the Law and Order Appeal did get a hearing in surrounding suburbs in the Twin Cities following the riots and the vandalism and the looting that took place in North Minneapolis in 1966 and 1967. Nixon, however, only got 40% of the vote in Minnesota, and the third party campaign of segregationist George Wallace garnered only 4% of the vote in Minnesota. The recent arrest of the right-wing white nationalist Boogaloo Boys who were involved in the looting and vandalism here may be a factor in the local vote this time. The story got front page coverage in the Star Tribune, the most widely circulated paper in the state. It may give pause to some of those who are susceptible to the Law and Order appeal, and particularly when that appeal is painted in black skin. And this is related to the third difference between 1968 and today, the racial composition of the protesters. Again, I can't emphasize this enough. The anti-police brutality protesters in the 1960s were exclusively African Americans. Today, the situation is quite different, not only in Minnesota, but elsewhere. For that reason, it has been hard for the Fox crowd to other the protesters as the media was able to do in the 1960s. More specifically, too many people of all skin colors participated in nonviolent protests in all kinds of communities. They personally saw what happened. They are less likely to be duped by what Tucker Carlson and company would like them to believe. Lastly, another key difference between 1968 and today. Today's actions take place in the United States where, quote, the American dream, unquote, is a fading hope for increasing numbers of workers in white skin. In 1968, they were much more likely to be true believers in the status quo, in defending it because they were beneficiaries. Anyone born after 1980 has a less than even chance of having the same life chances as someone born before then. That's a sobering fact that has to be taken into account in the equation. Let me end with what was also unique about the George Floyd protests in comparison with earlier protest movements in relation to presidential elections. With the 1964 presidential election on the horizon, all civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King, called for a moratorium on civil rights protests, beginning in the summer of that year. Everything, they argued, had to be subordinated to the elections in November to ensure Johnson's election and Goldwater's defeat. In other words, no protests. Wait until November. Very telling for me about what happened here and elsewhere is that despite calls by Democratic Party leaders like Stacey Abrams to end the protests, the George Floyd protesters did not heed the siren call of, quote, wait until November, unquote. That bodes well, I argue. Is there any doubt that if not for our actions in the streets, the 4 cops would have been indicted? That same determination will be needed to ensure that the 4 cops responsible for George Floyd's death do serious jail time. Thanks.
Thank you, August, for your historical perspective. Our next panelist is Professor Howard Lavine. Dr. Lavine is the Associate Dean of the Social Sciences in the College of Liberal Arts and the Arlene C. Carlson Professor of Political Science and Psychology. His work centers on the psychological underpinnings of mass political behavior. He is the author of 2 books and dozens of research articles. Dr. Lavine's research and commentary have been covered by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many other media outlets. Go ahead, Howie.
Hi, everyone. Can you all see me? Am I able to be seen?
Yes, Howie, we can see you.
Okay, good. I wasn't aware that I wasn't able to see myself. Well, good evening. It's great to be with you. Just a quick shout out to someone in the audience who was a mentor and a longtime friend, John Sullivan. I doubt that I would know very much about political science if it were not for John. So John, thank you very much for being here. So I'd like to discuss 2 questions. So advance, please, thank you. 2 simple questions that are more abstract really than the the current presidential election, and all of these questions have been raised for the past 2 decades, but very much related to this election as well. The first is, how do voters decide? And the second is, why did they decide this way? And these questions dovetail with the broader question, advance please, which is how does democracy work? So what I will do is present 3 views of democracy, settle on one of them, although all of them are operative, to some extent at different times, and then finish by addressing how we got to the view that I think many political scientists believe predominates now, and one that I think a lot of us believe constitutes a problem for democracy. So let's look at the first one so we can advance again. So the first is the issue voting view, which simply states that elections are about substance. They're about voters expressing their preferences on public policy. So what voters do is simply judge, compare, and vote on candidates' policy platforms. Next, please. So if this view is correct, if it's correct, politicians may generally reflect the will of the people. So in this view, voters lead and politicians follow, and this is prescribed by democratic theory. So if you'd like to see policy moved for the left, you generally want to vote for the candidate whose policy positions are more liberal. If you want to see policy moved to the right, you want to vote for the candidate who promises to enact conservative policies. Okay. The second view, and we can go again, is called the retrospective performance view. So it may be that policy voting is simply too hard for voters. One thing voters need to know to vote on the basis of policy is where the candidates themselves stand. And although that's been increasing as the result of political polarization, even today, only about 60% of voters can distinguish the positions of the different parties. So perhaps instead, voters look back on the performance of the president while in office, if there is an incumbent president. And they might ask such questions as, has the economy improved? Has the president solved or failed to solve an important problem facing the country? Okay. So here, voters do not lead on policy, but they do lead on performance, throwing out the incompetent or corrupt politicians, throw the bums out, and retaining those that have performed well. One problem with this view is that unengaged voters, who are not a non-trivial portion of the electorate, might not have good information. They might not know whether conditions have improved. And that engaged voters, well, their perceptions and evaluations might be biased. So retrospective voting tends to be suboptimal, at least with respect to the first view of democracy. Next, please. Okay, the last view that I'd like to talk about is what we refer to as the blind partisanship view, and I'm sure you've heard the phrase tribal loyalty, and this sort of characterizes this view. So perhaps voters lack crystallized or real policy views, and they lack an understanding of how a candidate has performed in the past, or as I mentioned, that such perceptions are biased. Instead, voters might simply blindly follow the views of their own party or a preferred candidate. So in this scenario, voters do not lead at all. They rather follow the leader. So here, politicians lead and voters follow, and this is certainly the opposite of what is prescribed by democratic theory. Okay. So which view is correct and how can we know? Well, we can't sort this out in 5 more minutes, but let's give it a shot. So let's ask the question, do voters engage in policy voting? Well, one thing we know is that voters' policy preferences are indeed correlated with their candidate preferences. So the more conservative a voter's preferences are, the more likely they are to support conservative candidates, for example. So maybe voters do lead. Perhaps they do choose candidates on the basis of policy agreement. But as we know, and as we love to say now, correlation does not imply causation. So we have a problem that we refer to as observational equivalence. So what we unfortunately cannot do is distinguish issue voting, that is the impact of issues on candidates, from what we might call persuasion or following the leader or blind partisanship, right? Which means that voters are simply changing their opinions to match those of candidates that they like for other reasons, right? By simply observing a correlation between voters' policy preferences and their candidate preferences. So the question then is, who leads? Now, again, as democratic theory would prescribe, if voters lead, that a priori policy preferences come first. Candidates come onto the scene, and then voters choose those candidates who best line up with the voters' policy preferences. By contrast, if voters follow, right, if what we're looking at here is blind loyalty, then candidate preferences come first. So voters decide to like a candidate for one reason or another. I like Donald Trump, he's a good business leader. I don't like him, I'm a Republican. And then what they do is change their own policy preferences to line up with those of candidates that they like for other reasons. So which one is it? Well, we don't have a lot of time, just a couple minutes left, but I'll give you a simple parlor trick that's been done a lot in political science, a simple experiment by taking two welfare policies, one more generous than the other, and simply asking whether liberals like the liberal policy better than conservatives do. And lo and behold, they do. Right? Okay, so maybe not going to win a Nobel Prize for that particular slide. But next, please. What if we were to add to the two policies what we refer to as a counter-stereotypic partisan cue? So we were to say, in effect, that Republicans are supporting, say Republicans in Congress are supporting the $1,000 a month policy, and the Democrats in Congress are supporting the $400 per month policy. With liberals, question is, would liberals continue to, let's go back. Would liberals continue to support the more generous or the more liberal policy, or would Republicans now come to support the more liberal policy because that policy is linked to the Republican Party? So are voters then choosing policy above party or party above policy? Now we can get to the next slide. Thank you, Lydia. So remember, in the no partisan cues condition, liberals simply liked the liberal policy better than the conservatives did. But now what we see is a very strong preference reversal, such that conservatives like the liberal policy much more, both than liberals now like it, and much more than they did before it was linked to a Republican cue. So what respondents are responding to is the cue, right? They're responding to whether it's a Republican policy or a Democratic policy. They're not responding to the substance of the policy itself. And so we come to the question of, why has partisanship taken on such a large role? Why has it sort of engulfed the field and become the most important predictor of almost any political behavior? So I'll just reserve the last minute to try and talk a little bit about that. So next slide, please, Lydia, thank you. So what we see here are two parties and a set of social group memberships or identities that are now strongly linked to each of the parties. And these social identities have always been important. Race has always been important. Whether you're from a city or from a small town has always been important. Gender has been important. Religiosity has been important. Right? Educational attainment has been important. In the past, these social identities were not linked to partisanship. Today, they are strongly linked to partisanship. So what we have in partisanship is something of a mega or a meta social identity. And what might be doing a lot of the work in making partisanship so powerful is the correspondence or the linkages to these underlying racial, gender, religious identities. Next slide. Now, we can also see this at the elite level. Hot tip to Kathryn Pearson. Thank you, Kathryn, for letting me borrow this slide. It always comes in handy. This is the freshman class, the first-term Republicans and Democrats in the current Congress, the 116th Congress. What you see on the right are a group of homogeneously white Christian men, with one exception. And on the left, what you see basically is the diversity of the United States. And so what we're seeing at the mass level is being mirrored at the elite level in Congress, and Kathryn talked quite a lot about that. And so what we're seeing really is a politics of social identity, right? So politics is, as others have described, groupish. So just a couple of quick conclusions. Next, thank you. There we go. Okay, one more. So citizens do not choose parties and candidates on the basis of their policy preferences, at least a lot of the time. Rather, it's the reverse. So we refer to this as democracy being inverted, right? So politicians are choosing, or in a sense, voters are choosing which policies they prefer on the basis of which candidates and parties they prefer, rather than the opposite. So we refer to partisanship as blind. So we're motivated to be loyal to the partisan tribe. And there's good reason for that. There are immediate psychological benefits that we can derive, such as self-esteem or the reduction of uncertainty or group solidarity. And then finally, I come to my last point, and this is perhaps the most problematic, and that is that blind loyalty prevents the public from holding political elites accountable. Okay, so if they pursue policies that are not the ones, right, that a majority, or at least a plurality of Americans prefer, and we don't hold them accountable, throw them out and elect politicians who would forward in policies that we do prefer, well, then we're not doing our jobs as democratic citizens. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Howie. Our final panelist is Dr. Tim Johnson. Dr. Johnson is Morse Alumni Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Law. A nationally recognized expert on U.S. Supreme Court oral arguments and Supreme Court decision-making, Dr. Johnson has published multiple books, research articles, and law review pieces. His research and commentary have been covered by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, and many other media outlets. Go ahead, Tim.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you to the staff, as everyone has said, for putting on this production tonight. I'm not sure if it's more difficult in person or over Zoom, but at least technologically, this is more difficult. And I appreciate the great turnout from everyone who's come to listen to my wonderful colleagues talk about the election tonight. So I want to talk about two questions this evening. The first is, what impact might the Supreme Court have or already have on the election? And then what impact may the election have on the Supreme Court itself? So let me turn to that first question. And there are a number of ways that the court may impact the election. The first is clearly through money. And this is not something, if you could click, please, I appreciate that. Thank you so very much. This goes all the way back to Citizens United, which has really allowed so much more money to be funneled into campaigns. We know that this will be the most expensive campaign in history. Already, about $5.2 billion has been spent in the presidential election and about $5.6 billion in congressional elections. And in terms of Citizens United, more than $1 billion has been poured into elections at both levels, the legislature as well, or Congress, as well as the presidential election by PACs, super PACs, corporations, and unions. And so money really, because of Citizens United, is having a much larger effect now, or at least playing a bigger role in the 2020 election than it has in any other election in history. The other way that the court is going to have an effect on this election is in its election prescient rulings, if you will. Already, as I note here, the court is close to a dozen rulings on issues about ballots and how long states can take to count the ballots that they have. You will note that as of yesterday, the court ruled in the Wisconsin case that indicated they would not allow for more time. On the other hand, it allowed for more time in the Pennsylvania case with a tie of 4-4 just late last week. It did hear, or the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals heard this afternoon, arguments in the Minnesota case, and there are also cases pending in North Carolina, as well as a rehearing for Pennsylvania. Now, I've got these words up here, shadow docket, and that doesn't necessarily mean anything nefarious, but what it does mean is that the court is quite specifically making decisions without full hearings. There are not legal briefs submitted by the parties. There are just arguments submitted by the parties. There are not open court oral arguments. And there is no opinion necessarily announced by the court, although you will note in the Wisconsin case, there were several concurring opinions as well as several dissenting opinions. And so you can get a sense of where the court comes down. I would encourage you to read. It's very short. 35 pages may not seem short to you, but it's pretty short for the court. I would encourage you to read Justice Kavanaugh's concurring opinion in the decision to not allow the additional 6 days of counting ballots in Wisconsin, as well as Justice Kagan's response to that concurring opinion. And it really sets up the two sides of the conservative and liberal sides in terms of counting votes and how that's going to play out as we get near the election, as well as after the election, with the additional caveat that the court is not going to tie in these matters anymore. Even though the Wisconsin case was decided 5-3, now you probably have a much easier chance with Justice Coney Barrett on the bench to have the justices decide against additional time, but time will tell on that. And the last point here is that there are many other cases besides the North Carolina and Pennsylvania cases that are percolating through the court. And these rules, which are all meant to deal with helping people not contract COVID potentially by going to the polls, may very well decide this election, not in terms of a Bush versus Gore scenario, but even before the election by deciding which votes are absolutely going to count. And in some senses, that is like Bush versus Gore, but instead of it happening after the fact, the court is actually making these decisions as the election is going on. If you have questions about the North Carolina case, the Minnesota case, or the Pennsylvania case, certainly bring them up during the Q&A session. There are also other ways that the court may actually have an impact on this election. Certainly with the oath of office being taken by Justice Coney Barrett last night, and then her official judicial investiture this morning, it is very clear that confirmation is going to have an effect on the election. And I'm not sure that Senator McConnell and President Trump made the right move here, although again, time will tell. They had a drum that they could beat, that they had an open seat on the court, that they could maybe drive Republicans to the polls. And now that seat has actually been filled. That drum is not beating for them anymore. And in fact, the drum may have been flipped, that the Democrats are now beating a much louder drum that says, Mitch McConnell and President Trump have rigged the process. They've put on someone to ensure a conservative majority for a very long period of time, 2, 3, 4, 4.5 decades long, as Justice Coney Barrett is only 45 or 48 years old right now. And that might drive Democrats to the polls. So very clearly that battle that happened in these past 40 days has something to do with the election and may very well drive turnout one way or the other. Second, President Trump specifically is using the Supreme Court as a rallying cry. And we know that while all the way back to 2000 and well before, candidates, and I think about 2000 with former Vice President Al Gore, trying to use the Supreme Court as a way to drum up votes, if you will. And the polls really show that that has never really helped candidates all that much. But in this election, beyond the Coney Barrett confirmation, both candidates seem to believe that bringing up issues that the Supreme Court will decide may very well help them. For President Trump, it is healthcare and it is abortion policy. And we know that on November 10th, the court is going to hear the ACA case, now not with 8 justices, but with a full 9-justice court. And on Friday, when the court sits for conference for the first time with a full bench since the death of Justice Ginsburg and the confirmation of Justice Coney Barrett, the justices will decide whether or not to put on the court's plenary docket or its merits docket the Mississippi abortion case. And that could be the impetus to overturn Roe versus Wade or chip away at reproductive rights much more substantially than those rights have been chipped away at in a very long time, at least since Casey in 1992. But the Biden campaign is using the Supreme Court to try to influence the election as well. It too is making an argument about healthcare and essentially saying, look, Judge Barrett, now Justice Barrett, was put on the bench specifically to help overturn the ACA, and we need to get people to the polls to make sure that that does not happen. But perhaps the more important argument that the Biden campaign is making is about the judiciary more generally, and that is the idea that the Senate and the current president in the White House rigged not only the Judge Coney Barrett confirmation process, but the process that stopped Judge Merrick Garland from ascending to the United States Supreme Court. And so the Biden campaign is really ramping up this argument and the rhetoric that says we need to talk about whether or not we need to reform the judicial system, not necessarily court packing, because Mr. Biden has really backed off of that argument in terms of saying, I want a bipartisan commission that will help us determine what we should do going forward with the judiciary, but really talking about whether there is some retribution that can be taken. And so in those three ways, as well as many others, the Supreme Court very clearly is going to play a prominent role and already has and will in these last 6 days of the election. Now, the second question is, will the election have an impact on the US Supreme Court? And the answer to that is a resounding yes. First off, there are clearly possible changes that can be made on the court. First off, there are 3 justices who are already over 70 years old. Justice Breyer is 82 years old. Justice Thomas is 72. Justice Alito is 70. And while I will not and do not make public predictions, there is very clear murmuring going on around legal circles that suggests if Vice President Biden wins the White House and if the Democrats win the Senate, that at a minimum, Justice Thomas is thinking about retiring during the lame duck Senate to allow President Trump to put another very conservative justice on the bench who is equally as young as Justice Coney Barrett, or maybe even younger than she is, to secure that conservative majority for a much longer period of time. There is some scuttlebutt, and I use that as a technical phrase, that Justice Alito may think of taking the same strategy, but that strategy is less clear. But there's decent evidence that Justice Thomas is thinking along those lines, and the Republican Party is trying to push him down that path. There's also possible stability on the court, and that is there are 3 justices now who are under 55 years of age. Justice Coney Barrett is 48. Justice Gorsuch is 53 and Justice Kavanaugh is 55. They are all slated to be on the bench for 30 and possibly 40 years or more. And that is for many of us in this room, the rest of our lifetimes at a minimum. And so while there will be some election impact, I raise this issue because it is that issue of these very young, very conservative justices that will lead a Biden presidency, if he has the Senate to do so, to think about taking retribution on the GOP for what it did with the 2 nominations that I've already talked about. And I'll refer to you back to 1991 when Justice Thomas ascended to the bench. And I've used this quote before when I've given talks like this. And he said, after being very upset about the Anita Hill part of his confirmation hearings, quote, "I'm going to be here for 40 years. For those of you who don't like it, get over it." And the ages of the justices very clearly will come into play, and the election will have some impact on how those ages play out in terms of who comes, who goes, and who stays on the bench. Finally, I want to talk about 3 scenarios very quickly. And those are, what happens, in fact, with different scenarios in terms of who wins the White House and who wins the Senate. If the Republicans win the White House and hold the Senate, then you can obviously know that the court is going to continue to lurch to the right. Justice Breyer, being 82, is most likely the next justice to retire from the bench. That would give them a 7-2 majority. And so that's the most likely scenario if Mr. Trump and Mitch McConnell hold on to their respective institutions. Second, you can consider if the parties split the White House and the Senate, everything's going to come to a grinding halt, as they did during the Clinton presidency for several years, and as they did for essentially the entire 8 years of the Obama presidency, where the Republicans stopped all nominations, not to the US Supreme Court, but at the US Circuit Court of Appeals and district courts. And you could see the Democrats doing the exact same thing if they win the Senate, but Mr. Trump wins the White House. And then finally, if Mr. Biden does win the White House and the Democrats take the Senate, you could see a number of scenarios, and I'll hold these for Q&A if you have questions about them. You could see court expansion. I don't like using the term court packing, and I'm very willing to talk about that, or court packing light. You could see the court taking tactics that they have the constitutional power to do so. That is jurisdiction stripping, telling the US Supreme Court it cannot hear certain types of cases. You can think about if there's not going to be expansion of the US Supreme Court, expanding to another federal court, whatever type of entity that may be, or expanding the lower courts in terms of the circuits as well as the district courts. So there are all sorts of tacks that could be taken by the Democrats if they win the Senate and they win the White House. But of course, as Kathryn and Howie point out, they have to do that first, right? They have to win next week in order to take that back. And so the bottom line is this, as I end and we move to Q&A. The court probably, I believe, is going to have a bigger impact on this election than it has on any presidential election in the history of the United States, although time will tell whether that is absolutely true. And then we also know for certain that the election will have some impact on the makeup of not only the US Supreme Court, but also the makeup of the entire federal judiciary for the coming decades at a minimum. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you to Tim and to all our panelists for the stimulating presentations. At this point, we have a number of questions in the queue, and so I'm going to start taking those questions and posing them to our panelists. The first question I would like to pose is to Tim and Kathryn as well. Tim, this possibility, these murmurs that Justice Thomas may step down during if it's a lame duck session and a Biden administration and a Biden Senate's coming in. If Thomas steps down, how does that change the Democrats' calculus? That is, if we have President Biden and a Democratic Senate, if Biden steps down, does that automatically mean we're much more likely to see court expansion? Tim and Kathryn, if you would address this question.
Sure, Kathryn, I'll begin because I see that you're still on mute. I'm not an advocate one way or the other normatively, but I believe that at a minimum beginning, a Biden administration would think about court expansion. But as I said in my talk, and I really just alluded to it quickly at the end, court expansion light. And that is, we're not going to pack the court a la FDR where we're going to put on 6 new justices and make it a court of 15. But what we are going to do is make a concerted argument to the public that it was not we who packed the court, it was the Republican Party that packed the court by stopping Merrick Garland and in fact forcing through in fewer than 40 days, the quickest in history, Justice Coney Barrett's confirmation. And so I could see a Biden administration saying, look, maybe we want to put on 2 new justices, make it 11. This is a compromise because the court would still stay 5 liberal, 5 conservative, with Chief Justice Roberts right in the middle. Now that still could lead to a tit for tat game. And so the Biden administration might not want to go down that road, but absolutely, Paul, if in fact Justice Thomas and then maybe even in turn Justice Alito in the worst case scenario for the Democrats would both retire in a lame duck session and get 2 very young, very conservative, or even 1 very young, very conservative justice on the bench, I can almost guarantee you that the Democrats would try to pack the court with even more than 2 if in fact they win the Senate and the White House. But that's probably the one scenario that would force the issue. They would probably use other administrative tactics rather than court packing because it would be more palatable to everyone involved.
Thank you, Tim. Kathryn.
Yeah, I mean, Tim gave great insight there. I would just also add that I think, whatever happens, if Biden is president, he will still convene this bipartisan panel. And then he also will take pretty quick action on other priorities like COVID, the economy, some sort of stimulus. I mean, so there are going to be a lot of things and a lot of sort of pent up pressures at once. But certainly with, lame duck retirements, I think just the pressure from the Democratic base would be enormous to have this bipartisan panel react in some way that sort of moderate Democrats and liberal Democrats could all live with. And like so many things, it would be a challenge, but I think the pressure would be enormous.
Thank you, Kathryn. Next up, a question for Andy. Andy, one of our attendees is asking for commentary about what we're going to see at the state level when Democrats pull off a trifecta. And are we going to see in other words, are unified Democratic government at the state level going to do what the Republicans have done in the period 2010 to the present? Are they going to draw new lines that really favor their party, or are they less likely to do that?
Thanks for the question. I think we have some evidence from the 2010 election cycle that Democrats are inclined to use redistricting to their advantage as Republicans are. One exception I think that's been mentioned a lot in the press is California, where instead of taking advantage in a partisan way, often the maps are drawn to protect incumbents of all stripes. And so again, it's sort of a we shall see. Thinking about which states might flip and become a trifecta, it wouldn't necessarily be states that, would have the massive impact, say, of a, North Carolina, Ohio, Florida, those types of states. So I think that, again, I think the possibility may be a little bit overstated, at least immediately.
Thank you, Andy. A question for you, August. Why do you think there has been a decrease in white support for the Black Lives Movement from the time of the George Floyd killing up until now? Is it just because of this, as you alluded to, sort of on Fox, the sort of cycling through and recycling of images of rioting and looting? Or is there another reason, other reasons why white support for the Black Lives Movement has declined throughout the summer and into the fall?
Yeah. First, again, it's important to keep in mind that the poll results reveal that white support for Black Lives Matter is at an all-time high compared to the situation, attitudes before the George Floyd protest. Yeah, I think there were problems with the movement itself and with the protests and not taking advantage of the sentiment and the change in sentiment had taken place. The Black Lives Matter movement, what was called Black Lives Matter, which was a real hodgepodge of all kinds of tendencies. There was no central leadership at all. And it depended and it varied from one city to another. And it failed in many ways, I think, to mobilize that sentiment and to mobilize it in a constructive way. Some of the protests became divisive. The identity card was oftentimes began to be employed. I remember speaking at a protest, and there was a person who spoke after me, a black man, young black man, who began to, in my opinion, to race bait the almost exclusively young white participants about their attitudes and so on. And rather than see the protest as a step forward, I think the movement itself lacked the kind of perspective to mobilize the sentiment and the changes that have taken place. But I'm convinced, though, in the long run, if you look at it historically, in terms of again what it was like prior to the George Floyd protests, I think it represents an important and a historic advance.
Thank you, August. I have a question for Howie. The next question is for Howie. Does voter age have an impact on identity politics? In other words, are Generation Z, are members of Generation Z more likely or less likely to have a propensity towards identity politics than, say, baby boomers?
Well, that's quite an interesting question, and one that I haven't considered. I mean, I'd have to say the null hypothesis is no, but I do think each political generation, is different not only, quantitatively, but quite possibly qualitatively. And I think this political generation is growing up under a stronger pull of identity politics than has been the case before. And this, of course, is a function of political polarization and a function of the social identities that have now become part and parcel of the coalitions of the two parties. And so that may well be a reason for younger people to construe politics normatively as a social identity competition rather than a strictly policy competition or partisan competition along any number of issue dimensions. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's quite likely that that is the case. Race and gender are more salient, especially under the Trump presidency. So that's another reason to think, that younger voters would see this as a more natural way of viewing and evaluating the political world. So quite possibly the answer to that is yes. And the answer, what's interesting about the answer is that it depends both on political polarization and on Trump's making race and gender so salient?
Thank you, Howie. And I like the spirit of that answer. It's a good question and it requires us political science professors to do more research. So sign me up for that question. I have another question for you, Howie. It's not a direct follow-up on generational differences, but it is related to the topic of your talk. Many liberals dislike conservatives. Many conservatives dislike liberals. We can say the same things about Democrats vis-a-vis Republicans. So a number of the comments that came in, particularly in the pre-registration part of this event, is there any real prospect for de-escalating these tensions and restoring trust and respect between Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives? Howie, if you can take this talking about sort of ordinary people at the grassroots, and then maybe Kathryn and Andy, if you could take that talking about political elites in state houses or the US Congress.
Sure. No, thank you. No, I think the immediate answer is no, but at some point there will be a realignment. So parties, continue to sort of maintain their coalition of voters until they begin to believe that they can no longer win elections that they should win, and then they realign. And the particular alignment of today is a large cause of what we refer to as affective polarization. So we're not, just to be clear, and this was embedded in the clever title of Lily Mason's book, Uncivil Agreement, meaning we are uncivil toward one another. We dislike each other, but we do not disagree with one another much more than we ever did before. So I would say the answer lies in one of the parties, probably the Republican Party, realigning. So if you think about the aftermath of the 2012 election, Reince Priebus, who was the head of the RNC at the time, wrote an exegesis suggesting that the Republican Party should not just simply be the party of white grievance or white voters. Of course, that's not what happened in 2016. It moved in the other direction. But at some point, as demographic change, balances out the percentage of whites, Latinos, African Americans, and so on in the electorate, we will see change that may well reduce the current tensions that we see now.
Thank you, Howie. And then if Kathryn and Annie can talk about the possibility of reconciliation among Democratic and Republican office holders in state houses and in the US Congress. You read the old accounts and Democrat and Republican legislators would have a beer after a particularly tough debate, and that doesn't happen anymore. What possibilities that might happen again at some point in the future?
Well, it's a great question, and it's a question that some members of Congress themselves are asking for, but not enough. And so right now, majority party leaders in each chamber, particularly the House, but in both chambers, have a lot of power. They set the agenda and they work out the deals, and they don't want to bring something to the floor that more than half of their caucus doesn't support. That's why we're seeing Senator Mitch McConnell is not about to bring a bill that Pelosi and even the president supports if at least half of his Republicans don't support it. And so, these party leaders, they listen to their caucuses, and there are more conservatives in among Republicans than there are moderates, and there are more liberals among Democrats than there are moderates. And so even as in the House of Representatives, you have this problem solvers caucus with Democrats and Republicans trying to work together. For example, working out a different relief package. It just doesn't work in the modern environment when party leaders have so much power, and because of the way districts are drawn, and it's not just gerrymandering, it's also in part the natural lines where districts are drawn. Partisans tend to be clumped together in districts, and so the electoral incentives for the type of compromise that we're talking about just aren't there currently. And the way the parties are structured and the agenda is structured, party leaders don't have those incentives either. So hopefully over time their incentives will be changed, but that may take a while.
Andy, thank you, Kathryn.
Yeah, it's a terrific question, a really difficult question as well. And so I'll fall back on the answer that I often give to my state politics class, which is it sort of depends on which state you're focusing, in the sense that those who have tried to track polarization, not at the national level, but at the state level, would say that there are some states that in which the legislatures look a lot like Congress. They're highly polarized. There are some states that are even more polarized than Congress. Minnesota happens to be one of those. And if you think back to some of the shutdowns and other things that have happened here, it's a reflection of those sorts of changes. However, there are other states where there actually is less polarization. And so in those states, I think there is this possibility of working across state lines. And then just to give one example of that, I don't know whether this coalition will last beyond next week's election, but in Alaska, the lower house is actually run by a coalition. In other words, Democrats and Republicans have gotten together and they're basically, they're a majority. It's a certain component of each of the two parties. And so I think that what Kathryn said about geographic clustering is really important, and it's even more important at the state level where you see some of these really, really striking differences.
Thank you, Andy. I want to segue back to the Supreme Court now with a question for Tim. Who takes the place of Chief Justice John Roberts as the pivotal justice on the Supreme Court? And media presentations and coverage of Chief Justice Roberts suggest he's really, one of his primary concerns is maintaining the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. Is the new pivotal justice is likely to share that concern to the degree that Chief Justice Roberts shares it?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. I think the pivotal justice now actually becomes Justice Brett Kavanaugh. And in some cases, depending, maybe in criminal rights cases, it may be Justice Neil Gorsuch, but it's most likely in most cases going to be Kavanaugh. And the answer is certainly no. An associate never shares the same views of the court's legitimacy and position in the system of separated powers as a chief does. Now, does that mean that the associate justices don't care about the court's legitimacy? Of course not. They all do concern themselves with it because the only power the court has is its legitimacy. It will continue to fall on the shoulders of Chief Justice Roberts to try to pull in Justice Kavanaugh and pull in Justice Gorsuch to make sure that maybe they make up this middle moderate wing of the court, much in the same way that Justices Kennedy, O'Connor, and Souter did in the early, mid to late 1990s and early 2000s. Barring that, the median has gotten incredibly conservative on the bench, and policy really will ultimately trump thinking about courts' legitimacy.
Thank you, Tim. And a follow-up, what does that mean then for the future of Obamacare? Recognizing you're not in the prediction game, but sort of to sketch out some of the possibilities here, is it?
So it's interesting. This is going to largely depend on, in some sense, the position of Justice Amy Coney Barrett as to whether or not she would recuse herself from that case. I doubt that she will. There's already been an ask for her to recuse herself from election-related cases. She did take a position on the ACA publicly in 2012. That could be a reason for her to recuse in that case, being argued on November 10th, but I don't think that she will. I think that the court, if the Chief Justice can be persuasive, I think the court kicks the ACA case to the curb and says, we're not going to decide the merits of it, or we will absolutely sever the individual mandate. Because in fact, and especially if President Trump wins the election, it's not a partisan thing to say there is no plan from the Trump administration right now. And if the court scuttles the entire ACA without there being a plan in particular to protect the millions of people with pre-existing conditions, there is a massive policy problem in the United States. And the court is not immune, and none of the justices are immune from worrying about the policy consequences of their decisions.
Thank you, Tim. I'd like to cycle back to August now. This was a really provocative question that came in a little while ago. August, one of our viewers writes, there have been a large number of white people, as you mentioned before, a large number of whites marching alongside Black Lives Matter protesters. In some cases, as you noted, white protesters greatly outnumber people of color. Does the increase in white participation reflect a principled commitment among many whites to sort of acknowledge and combat systematic racism in a genuine way? Or is it more like the gentrification or the symbolic expression of white guilt that's not going to have any staying power once folks are done marching and protesting side by side?
Yeah, I think, as I've said before, I think the most important kind of voting is done with our feet. I'm a product of it. I think that's the basis for attitudinal change. And one can't predict where many of these people will go, but it's important to recognize what has happened in the past with mass protests and how mass protests have indeed led to massive change in public opinion. Coming out in the streets and marching, I think, is much more effective in terms of bringing about change and advancing a progressive agenda than the electoral process itself. So yeah, people have raised this question about the sincerity of people. For me, the most important thing is that they've come out. Those of us who were active in the civil rights movement, we look at people, what they're actually doing. We're not trying to get into people's heads. I don't know what's in my head most of the time. So try to get in somebody else's head and to determine whether or not they're sincere or not. Yeah, I leave that to people who are more capable of doing that than I am. The main thing is that they're putting their bodies on the line when you're coming out into mass protest, and when your neighbors see you, other people see you, and the kind of solidarity that comes with that is of enormous importance. That to me is the most important thing.
Well said, August. Thank you. We're at 8:01, but I'm going to just pose two final questions before we wrap up. And I'd like to throw these questions out to all of our panelists. So just should the urge strike you, just chime in. Let's make an assumption that Biden wins and the Democrats take the Senate. What happens to the Republican Party? What kind of self-reflection or lack of self-reflection do the Republicans engage in if the Democrats get the trifecta at the national level? And again, I'll throw it out for anyone who wants that.
Well, I'm going to start with some history and talking about 2012 after Mitt Romney lost. When President Obama was running for re-election, Mitt Romney lost. And after that election, Republicans convened and issued a sort of big and sincere report about rebuilding the party. And the report really emphasized recruiting more young people, recruiting more people of color, and essentially broadening the tent of the Republican Party. And everything that happened with the Trump campaign in the nominating contest in 2016 and the general election and during his presidency has pretty much done the exact opposite. If you look at sort of voter results and public opinion polls. And so I think the question, and so, you know, the president is the head of the party. That's true for both parties, whoever the president is. And so if Trump loses re-election, he's no longer the head of the party, but most of the key party officials have worked pretty closely with him. And for the most part, their constituents have been supportive of that. Those who haven't are likely to lose their Senate re-election races. And so I think it will be a long process. I don't think it happens overnight because many of the, you know, if Trump loses, the highest ranking Republicans will have been working very closely with him. And so it would be a process that might take a couple of election cycles to recover for him. That said, it's important to remember that the party who controls the White House typically loses seats in a midterm election. And so there's also that to weigh as well. And I'll let others try this hard question. Thanks.
Thank you, Kathryn. Does anyone else want to weigh in on when does the Republican reflection and reevaluation begin, assuming the Democrats sweep the Senate, take the presidency, and maintain the House?
I'll take it too. So I think the question is not only one of, what Kathryn referred to as the report coming out of the RNC at the end of Mitt Romney's loss to Barack Obama, but it's a question of whether the party sees itself, at least in the mass electorate, as one that can win on the first dimension of politics. That is, can it win on supply side tax cuts and deregulation, or can it win on the second dimension of politics that gets defined differently depending upon what cultural issues are salient? And I strongly believe that they are unlikely to win on the first dimension. So I don't think the party is ever going to quite be the same as it was. I think it's been moving, into the sort of populist cultural space since 1968. And I think it realizes, that the power of its electability comes from its outcompeting the Democrats on that second cultural dimension. Roughly half of the Republican voters disagree with the party's economic policy. And being economically conservative has very little influence on whether you are a leaning Republican, a weak Republican, or a strong Republican. By contrast, holding conservatively cultural opinions has a very strong impact on how strong a Republican you are. And so I think there will be a tension within the party, say, for example, between the Lincoln group on one hand, who would like to return the economic establishment and compete on the first dimension, and those who probably see their fortunes playing out better by continuing to compete on the second dimension, which unfortunately does include social identity and racial politics.
Thank you, Howie. Just to flip the question one final time, and then Andy or August, I think August, you have to run off to class. So if Andy, thank you for your participation, August, of course. And then Andy, if you want to take this one, what happens to the Democratic Party if Trump is reelected and the GOP retains the Senate? You've got a battle royale between progressives and moderates, and how might that play out if you would care to speculate freely and you're not bound by these speculations?
I'm not bound by these speculations, but I do notice that this event is being recorded, right? So, I think I would go back to something Kathryn said earlier, which is that I think whether Democrats win a trifecta at the national level, or whether Trump is reelected and they don't win control of the Senate, I do think there are these already existing fissures within the Democratic Party that are going to come to the fore after the election. And I think one of the things Republicans have tried to do during this campaign season is to try to exacerbate some of those tensions. And for the moment, I think Democrats have cohered around the idea of a common opponent and the necessity of winning this election. And I think that regardless, in the aftermath, there will be a sort of a discussion, debate, whatever you want to call it, about what it means to be a Democrat after 2020. And so the more progressive wing of the party will be pushing for certain things, and the more moderate wing of the party will be maybe pushing a different set of priorities. I think Tim's not here, so I can step on his turf, but I think one of the interesting things about what's happened over the past week is that many individuals, particularly Democratic senators who one might think of as moderates, are using much stronger language to discuss the issue of the Supreme Court than we had heard, even just a couple of weeks ago. And so I do wonder, whether that that will last beyond next Tuesday. But we as with many of these questions, these great questions, we shall see.
Thank you, Andy. I have 8:08, so I'd like to bring this event to a close. Just a couple of final comments. Number one, check out our department website this week for more information on how to access the recording of this event. I want to thank our fabulous panelists for their incisive commentary tonight. I want to thank Lydia Boulder, Alexis Cuttons, Sarah Flannery, and Sean Burns for their masterful work behind the scenes to keep this running smoothly. And again, I want to thank all of you who participated tonight for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk about what I think all of us would probably agree is going to be the most consequential election in our lifetime. That's something of a cliche many times. I don't think it's a cliche this time. So thank you all. Stay safe. Good night, and see you in 2022 when we return to McNamara to do our Views from the U event at the next midterm elections. Take care, everyone, and good night.